Julian is a solution architect, and he's really got a flair for the creative. So his career has led him to a lot of clients, and he uses his love of technology, his ability to think creatively, to allow him to help create and provide some clarity. You know, often fresh thinking and ideas to deliver products and services happen at times when you really want that, right? And it usually takes someone with a fresh outlook. I think Julian is that guy. His skill set involves knowledge from all aspects of system design. He has worked in a number of challenging environments across multiple suppliers, and he brings his experience and modern product development techniques to the table. Julian, please come on and join us here.
Hello, everybody, and very happy to be here. Thank you very much. I don't think I've ever had quite such a hype man working before, Jeff, so thank you for that. It's a great intro.
Well, you know, when people have the amount of experience and knowledge and a great concept that they're ready to share, it really deserves that. So I'm really grateful to have you here today, and I know everyone's going to be very interested in what you share. So without further ado, why don't I turn it over to you, Julian? Please go ahead and share your screen, and we'll begin the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Just hop over into the presentation itself. Yeah, my name is Julian. I am here today from Dalton Day, Candola. So we're a small IT company based here in the United Kingdom, and I'm presenting to you today from my father-in-law's house because I've had a few internet issues, but hopefully that's the end of the tech issues, and we'll crack on from here. So essentially, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a sandwich of all things, which sounds bizarre, and I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, oh my gosh, where on earth is this going? But actually, what we're going to be discussing today is very relevant to the previous presentation, in fact. So I had somebody coming on right before me who was talking about very similar things to what I want to talk about, which is a lot to do with ethics, supply chains, and how we look after our world moving forward through a rather abstract example. So maybe you'll have to bear with me just a little bit. Yeah, I was actually really pleased to attend the previous session because I thought, well, that's a really neat segue into what it is that I'm going to be talking about. So what am I talking about today? Well, the digital sandwich, sandwiches, and blockchain. And bear with me because there is an angle to this that I think kind of works. So first of all, what is a digital sandwich and why am I harping on about it? Well, first of all, this is a real sandwich. This isn't CG or something that I made up or whatever I did in Photoshop. This is actually a sandwich that I ate. And I was munching away on this thing thinking, I have absolutely no idea what is in this. And that's actually quite an interesting topic for a presentation. I wonder how technology could help me with that. So the sort of architecture brain that I've got going on, it started whirring away, and I thought, well, okay, let's delve a little bit deeper into this. So today's presentation is all about that. So we're going to use this particular sandwich, this real sandwich from the real world, to have a little bit of a deep dive into supply chains, into ethics within IT, and also into the blockchain. Now, it's worth mentioning up front, I am not an expert on the blockchain. I'm sure there will be people who are on this who are slightly better qualified than me when it comes to this. But I think as architects, generally, we have I'm not going to say responsibility, but it's impossible for any one of us to know everything about every single topic across the entire industry. We can know some topics in great detail, but I think part of the skill of being a good architect is being able to do good research and learn about new things. And so in many ways, I'm excited to talk about blockchain today because it's not something that I have huge amounts of practical experience with, but it's just fascinating. It's something that's really interesting to me and hopefully will be to you guys as well. So in terms of the sandwich itself, so there is also a slightly patriotic reason that I picked a sandwich because sandwiches were invented in England, and as you may be able to tell from my accent, I am actually from the UK as well. So Sandwich is a place, and just in case anyone didn't know, and the Earl of Sandwich was a chap who many moons ago was playing cards with his buddies. He was obviously a bit of an aristocrat, had plenty of time for that kind of thing. And he used to go and grab himself a snack, which was 2 bits of bread with some meat in between. And people eventually started asking him, for a sandwich. And if you can believe it, that is the origin of the word sandwich, which is now used all over the world. And many of you would recognize, but yeah, it's an English invention, so pretty good. So, what is the digital sandwich, and what am I talking about here? Well, I snapped that particular photo of one of the most humble and widely available and popular sandwiches here in the United Kingdom. I have no idea how popular it is across the rest of the world. You'll probably think we're mad for eating this kind of thing. But the reason I snapped it was because it's one of the simplest and most functional sandwiches that you can get here in the UK. So the Almond cheese and pickle sandwich is basically 2 slices of bread, 2 slices of cheddar cheese, something called Branston pickle. I'm not entirely sure how familiar everyone else is going to be with that. It's a bit like a kind of relish thing, or I don't know if you guys have pickles everywhere else, but it's kind of it's like a preserve that's got a bunch of different stuff in it, vegetables and all sorts of things, and it's absolutely delicious. If you ever come here and you've never tried Branston before, or you can get hold of it in your own country, then you should, because double thumbs up. And then there's a bit of butter or margarine, and that's pretty much it. So as you can see, very simple, very easy to get hold of the ingredients for a cheese and pickle sandwich, and not particularly complicated, basically. It's very easy to make as well. So literally anyone can make one of these things. There's no particularly specialist skills involved. And that's another important aspect to this, because I wanted to pick an example which was very simple, very straightforward, in order to kind of elaborate further on the point that I'm trying to make. So what I'd like to talk about today in relation to that sandwich is what is in this thing. What does that have to do with the future of technology and how we approach architecture? And should we care about what is in the things that we are consuming? So I'm using the example of a sandwich because it's simple, but this could equally apply this kind of logic to the example of the supply chains behind the infrastructure that we deploy as architects, behind the servers that we deploy, behind the components that those things are made of. Do we have any idea where they come from? Should we have an idea of where they come from? Is it part of the ethical framework that we all work within as architects to know where these things come from and understand the provenance of the things that we're deploying? Even if you're using cloud, where you might say, okay, this is someone else's problem, it's not my problem because I'm not deploying the physical architecture. Well, you're still using it, you're still renting it, like the previous presenter mentioned. So yeah, I think it's a good topic to look at. So on to the next slide. So, if you can believe it, this is everything that is in my sandwich. I'm not sure I could believe it when I quite looked at it, but it is. So most of the stuff's actually in the pickle, because, as I said, that has a whole bunch of different bits and pieces in there. But even in something like the bread, I mean, it's just bread, right? I make bread at home. I know how to make bread, and when I do it, it's yeast, flour, water, and salt. Those are the 4 things I put in my bread. This bread, which came from a shop, has a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And I became interested in this as a topic because I thought, well, I have no idea where any of these things come from, and how might I be able to sort that out? How might I be able to find where these things come from? What's the provenance of them? So that essentially is what I decided to look into. So the first steps were to pick an ingredient from this list. And when we were trying to narrow it down a little bit, that was a tricky thing to do because there are millions of them in here, obviously, and they all have their own unique properties and bits and pieces. We had to try and pick a winner from within this and then work out a methodology for going after not going after, but at least speaking to the suppliers of these goods that I was consuming to try and work out exactly how they had sourced these bits and pieces and where they'd come from. So everyone's favorite, calcium propionate. So as all of you will know, because it's so insanely popular, this is a mold preventer which is used in pickle and my 2 slices of white bread. And I've just thrown up on here the chemical composition for any of you chemistry experts who are on the line. And we decided that we wanted to try and pick a particular ingredient and run with that. Now, why calcium propionate? Well, because it's something I'd never heard of, if I'm completely honest, before I started trying to put this presentation together. And we thought it would be fun to examine all the different aspects of how we might be able to go after that and work it all out. So we went on a bit of a journey here, and I'm now going to take you through what the journey was to try and work out where this one particular ingredient that my bread and my pickle have shared between them, where it comes from and how. So the first thing that we did was we went and had a chat with the chatbots that are available on the suppliers' websites for my bread and my pickle. So Branston is the company that makes the pickle, as I mentioned earlier on, and Hovis are a large bread and baked goods company over here in the UK, and they may be international as well, I'm not 100% sure. and they both have a chatbot, which is super helpful, right? Very modern, very cool. So we went and had a chat with the chatbot and said, hey, can you tell me where your calcium propionate comes from? And it's fair to say that the bot did not know how to handle that particular request. So that wasn't going to get us anywhere. Sadly, neither Branston nor Hovis were willing to tell me where this, sadly, neither of the bots were willing to tell me where they sourced this thing from. And in all honesty, the fact that the automated infrastructure that we have, the fact that things like chatbots that we deploy, I mean, I've deployed them for my clients on numerous occasions. I've never really considered adding supply chain related questions to the library of potential questions and question and answer type responses that the bots that I've deployed have. Similarly, questions around ethics and how ethically you source things, how green things are. Maybe the green stuff might be in there for some chatbots, but most of it is usually about how you get in contact with us, how you talk to customer services, all these kinds of things. And I think one takeaway that I found from this journey was very much that maybe we should be thinking about being able to answer these questions, because I can tell you that Hovis and Branston most certainly had not thought about this. Just a little bit of interest, by the way, on Branston Pickle. So Branston Pickle, as I said, it's awesome, but it was originally from India, actually. So it was one of the things that the British stole when we proceeded to not have the most salubrious record over there, shall we say, back in the Empire days. And Branston, through various different bits of ownership, through Japanese ownership at one point, I think, and a few other things, have remained sort of an English company, but not quite. But they're very heavily associated with England. But yeah, there's a bit of colonial history there as well behind what Branston Pickle actually is and where it was invented. So in many ways, it is a pretty global product that has provenance from all over the place. But again, talking to the chatbot, you wouldn't know that really. You wouldn't be able to get all of that information on what the product was, where it originally came from, and so on. So the next step was to call them, give them a ring, and find out whether or not they had any idea where their calcium propionate came from. So I phoned up both companies and had a good old chat to them, and both of them assumed it was a prank call, or a crank call, I guess, if that's how you refer to it. So yeah, they weren't super helpful, it has to be said. I think they just thought I was mad. But I said, I'm doing this for a presentation and I would love to know where this particular ingredient comes from. What can you tell me about your supply chain? Where does this stuff come from? And they had absolutely no idea what I was harping on about, and nor could they put me in touch with anybody who did have an idea of what I was going on about. So I just thought, oh, okay, well, I've kind of hit the buffers here with the actual suppliers themselves. So let's turn to the internet and see what we can find out from there. So how can we find out where calcium propionate comes from? Well, we had a look at the internet, and this little graphic here is provided by a particular website that deals with the sourcing of chemicals and stuff like that. And there are a number of different suppliers, as you can see, all across the globe for calcium propionate. We've got some in North America, some in Europe, and some over in the Far East. And it's very, very difficult to tell which of those three silos effectively it's coming from. So that's not super helpful either in terms of how we track down this thing and where it came from and how it ended up in my sandwich and then in my stomach. So it is progress, though, to find out that there are certain areas in the world that this is sourced from in particular. So we're unable to pinpoint, as I say, exactly where the specific chemical that was in my particular product came from. But there's also this idea about the credentials of the organizations and all of that good stuff. How do I understand whether there is any accreditation around where this chemical comes from, and so on and so forth. So it can be very hard sometimes to understand the journey and the mileage as well, the ethical and green implications of where these things have come from. So if this stuff was manufactured in China, for example, and it had ended up on my plate, that would have a different food mileage. It would have a different journey to reach my plate. And so it is interesting to think, well, okay, maybe we should be using, or maybe the suppliers who are supplying me should be using the particular suppliers who are in Europe, because they're much closer to me. So if they're making bread in England, should they be shipping stuff from China? Again, I wasn't able to find out exactly where the stuff came from, but it's an interesting idea, right? Sometimes the actual suppliers themselves, I don't think actually know. So when I had a chap, there was one particularly helpful chap at the bread making company he did try to give me some information on this, but he just said, I'm not actually sure that we know exactly where this has come from. We kind of buy it from wholesale markets and we don't know exactly where it's come in from, where that batch in particular came from. We just need to source it and use it, because otherwise our bread will go off on the shop shelves. You know, there's nothing else we can do. So it's interesting, isn't it, that even the supplier themselves were struggling to tell me where my calcium propionate in my sandwich had come from. So supply chain unknown, what could potentially give us what we need in terms of this solution? You know, how could we look at providing more transparency with our supply chains, providing potentially more ethical information around where our goods have come from and how we source them? How could you make a better informed choice? Well, probably one of the most obvious solutions to this, and I'm not saying it's the only solution, and I'm not necessarily saying it's the best solution, but it was the solution that I found most interesting to try and link to this example, is the blockchain. And most famously, the blockchain underpins Bitcoin, which everybody will have heard of. And the key things with the blockchain is that it is pretty immutable. You know, there's proof that suppliers were part of a particular supply chain if they're on the blockchain. So what I'm going to elaborate on now is, well, okay, why does that actually help us? You know, what is a blockchain? How does it work? And why does it enable us to have this greater transparency around our supply chains and make more informed decisions? If, for example, the bread making company Hovis or Branston, who made the pickle, were on the blockchain and had this ledger in front of them, could they have told me where that calcium propionate comes from that's in my bread and in my sandwich? So what is blockchain at a really high level? So as I said, I'm not an expert in blockchain, but what it is interesting to do is have a kind of bluffer's guide. So this is actually something that we talked about quite extensively on the podcast series that my company does. So I've done this a couple of times, so hopefully I will make a reasonably good job of explaining what it is, but only at a very high level. So don't hit me with loads of technical questions around blockchain at the end. So essentially what the blockchain is a series of data blocks which are connected to one another. And in order to connect them together, in order to form those links in the chain, you use hashes, which I think most of us should be familiar with, but it's like a digital fingerprint essentially. So you take the data, you create a hash from that data. That hash will always be unique as long as the data is unique. And then that hash becomes that digital fingerprint for the particular block that you are looking at. And each block in a blockchain has the hash of the previous block, so the fingerprint from the previous block in the chain, and then it has the hash of its own data. So it has its own fingerprint and it has the previous fingerprint from the block between it. And that's what forms the chain. Each one of those blocks then contains a number of transactions. And in theory, you can then build up a really, really complex picture about where things have come from and what the total supply chain to produce something that's at the end of the chain was by tracing your way back down the chain. There's no hiding places within blockchain. It's obvious who is involved because all of the previous blocks link into your block at the end, so you can trace your way back through. And when it comes down to what additional info you want in terms of suppliers, something like blockchain would potentially give you that way of finding out the provenance of the things that you are talking about. So how does that work, right? So if you've got this particular chain that exists in one place, in one particular location, in one particular machine, potentially. So how does a blockchain work across geographies? How does a blockchain work in various different areas around the globe? How does someone who is on the blockchain in England deal with a supplier who's in China, for example, without being, and how do they gain certainty that that blockchain hasn't been tampered with or that there isn't anything going on in order to try and hide things? Because if you're introducing a system which has a complete degree of transparency to it, people are naturally going to want to try and hide stuff potentially, or there's always that risk that people will. Well, what's interesting about the blockchain is that it uses a distributed ledger. So essentially what you've got is nodes, which are effectively people or systems around the globe, and everybody has a full copy of the ledger. So on the previous slide, we looked at this little chain here, but in this really high level and slightly silly example, basically you've got nodes A, B, C, and D, which could be, you know, different systems across geographies. It could be people, it could be whatever, but generally it's always going to be a computer. There's always a tech angle in there somewhere. It's not literally a person who just has a book that's printed them all out. And everybody has a copy of that particular ledger. So it means that everyone has the same ledger on their machine. And therefore, everyone has a copy of every transaction and a copy of the complete chain, which means that it's very difficult for somebody to edit the master ledger in air quotes, because there's no such thing as a master ledger on the blockchain. There are multiple copies of the ledger which are sent to everybody who has an interest in the blockchain. So if you edit yours and you try to cover something up or hide it, all the other ledgers will disagree with your ledger, and that means that that change will get rejected effectively. So it's distributed across a network of nodes, and there is a consensus mechanism. So basically all the different nodes across the network must agree that that particular blockchain is accurate, or that particular ledger entry for that blockchain is accurate, so the ledger of all the transactions. If there isn't consensus across the network, then effectively somebody trying to submit a new transaction into the chain will have that transaction rejected, because clearly they're trying to do something that is not accurate to all the other ledgers. So each node or computer essentially has a vote. They have this ability to say, okay, I agree with this, or no, I think something untoward is here, and the majority carries it. Okay, so it's essentially first past the post if you want to talk election systems. And so essentially the data is only committed onto the blockchain and propagated out to all the other ledgers if everybody agrees on it. So one corrupted or tampered with ledger can't then propagate across the rest of the blockchain and allow changes to it. Transactions in the blockchain are added by suppliers, by companies, and by accreditors. So with our calcium propionate, our chemical, for example, there will be people who are making sure that that chemical is being correctly sourced and it's being produced in a safe way. People who produce chemicals get inspected, for example. And so some of the transactions on that blockchain ledger might end up being from them, from the accreditors, from people giving it the stamp of approval to say, yep, this has been produced properly. It's pure calcium propionate. You're not going to poison a bunch of people if you put it in your bread or your pickle. In fact, everyone involved in the supply chain, is given a certificate so that they can authenticate with the blockchain. So PKI infrastructure stuff, most of us will be familiar with on this call, I think. And without that, there is no access. So you can't just come flying into a blockchain and start messing around with it. You have to be somebody who is approved for access to that blockchain, for access to a copy of the ledger. So you have to be approved as a node, and you have to have the certificate in order to get in. So let's all just pause for a second and spare a thought for the poor guy over here in the United Kingdom, a guy called James Howells, who has approximately $200 million worth of Bitcoins on a hard drive and threw it away by mistake. And it ended up, his certificate that he had to access that blockchain and those Bitcoins that he has the ownership for ended up in a landfill somewhere here in the UK. And he's now trying to convince a bunch of people to go dig that up with him so he can try and find this laptop hard drive because he forgot it somewhere. So don't lose your certificates, folks, if you're on the blockchain, because you may regret it. But yeah, that's an example of how stringent that policy is. So if you lose that certificate, if you don't have that anymore, you are not getting back in, even if you did actually have the legal right to own those particular Bitcoins in this case, or if you had the right to accredit that chemical, in my example, you won't get back in if you manage to lose your certificate. So be really careful with what you do with them. There he is, good old Jeff. So basically there are two types of blockchain, and I'm not going to go flying off down into this, mostly because I don't actually understand the difference between the two of them in enough detail to give you a really comprehensive overview. But essentially there are two types of blockchain. There is a hyperledger fabric, which is a private blockchain network used by organizations, and I am going to loop back to that word private. That's important to keep an eye on because there are some implications for that for the blockchain. And individual organizations or companies would generally use that to track compliance of a product or a platform that they're launching. So it's essentially a private blockchain. And then there's what's called the Ethereum fabric, which is the public blockchain network, which is used in the public domain, Bitcoin being probably the example of that, but there are other examples of blockchain applications out there increasingly. So we've seen stuff like MFTs being used to sell digital artworks, or the right to the very first tweet. I think the ownership of that, and one of the Twitter founders put out and made a huge amount of money selling a little while ago, that's going to be in the Ethereum fabric side of things that's being done. So companies like Jeff's Amazon here, they're offering both of these things as a product offering via AWS, and that is coming now. So we're seeing more and more companies adopt these and start to offer them as a product and a service that you can subscribe to using the SaaS kind of model that we're all used to. So this is definitely going to become more prevalent, but there are some issues with that happening. So use cases for blockchain in the modern supply chain One thing that we could do, as well as sourcing my calcium propionate for my sandwich, is we could also look at ways to crack down on particular problems that we have. So going back to the green angle from the previous presenter, this is, again, I said it was a good segue, and it was, because I've been thinking about this stuff as well. So one task that blockchain might be used for example, is to crack down on greenwashing. So hydrogen can be made from very dirty fuels without high quality carbon capture. This, hydrogen is often seen as the future for everything from powering rockets, so that they're shooting clean water out the back of them when they fly off into space, rather than burning solid rubber and all sorts of other horrible things that people burn in order to get to space, to hydrogen fuel cells for cars, to using hydrogen for powering houses and things like this. There's a lot of talk around hydrogen right now, but there's also a lot of unscrupulous production of hydrogen. And green hydrogen is more difficult to come by, and it's more expensive than unethically produced hydrogen. So new rules could be used to measure and disclose the life cycle of emissions arising from these production processes. And with the blockchain, you wouldn't be able to argue with it. So if, for example, we said you need to be on the blockchain if you're going to sell hydrogen to us, and we have to see the provenance of that and how you've produced it, and we have to have appropriate accreditation from people who are on that blockchain before we buy your product, that by virtue of that very transparency, you're going to design in better ethical behavior, better, greener ethical behavior into those supply chains. It's harder for somebody to be unscrupulous if everything that they're doing is there in an immutable ledger, which they can't edit the master on, right? Because it's distributed throughout the globe and throughout the fabric of the blockchain. So that's a way that we can disincentivize those kind of behaviors from companies because of that transparency. A ledger of those participating in the manufacture, as I said, what process they used, all of that could be critical to understanding where that hydrogen came from and how. You can also see, again, how this could be used as an incentive to get additional endorsement. So, for example, if you were on that blockchain producing hydrogen and you were able to demonstrate that you were the greenest of the green, but you charged a premium for your product, well, what a great way to sell that product, to be able to say, look, if you look at the technology, the blockchain doesn't lie, therefore you can be sure that our hydrogen is greener than all our competition, and you can prove it. Well, people may be more willing to pay that premium for your product, right? It's all transparent and it's all right there in the ledger. That's the key point with this. Another one that I came across, and I don't know again whether or not everybody has this across the world, but here in England we have this particular traffic light system, we call it, where each bit of food that we consume now legally has to have this traffic light rating, like the bottom thing, the thing down at the bottom there that I've put up, the image, which tells you how many fats, how many sugars, salts, etc. are in this particular packaged item, how much each serving contains and what the calorie content is, and how much that is of an adult's reference daily intake. And this is intended to mean to allow consumers to make an informed choice. So by colouring these things and having green as being on the healthier end of the spectrum, what the government is trying to do is incentivize people to buy stuff which is more green across the board, right? Which will be the healthier products. And this will help with driving down obesity levels. It will help with taking the pressure off the National Health Service here, because we have this nationalised healthcare system here in the UK. And that costs an awful lot of money, and a lot of the burden that is on that healthcare system is delivered or is created by people making poor choices in terms of the foods that they eat and leading a more unhealthy lifestyle. So, of course, as somebody buying a sandwich in a hurry, it's kind of impractical to grab all the accurate data. But if, for example, the blockchain was underpinning this kind of thing, you can be sure that there's more accurate data, and you can show different types of data. So you could present it in ways that grab your customer. So this isn't just about holding people who are doing bad things to account. This is also about providing people with that transparency and with that knowledge of what is in the things that they are eating and consuming. And meaning that if somebody has a use case like mine, where I'm saying, well, where does this particular chemical in my sandwich come from, it's actually possible for someone to demonstrate not only that it was sourced ethically, but that it was produced in a green way, if you've got that blockchain ledger that starts right from the beginning and works all the way through. So the answer wouldn't be, I don't know. The answer would be, I can tell you exactly what all of that is. And to be honest, if Hovis, the bread supplier, or Branston, the pickle supplier, had that when I made these inquiries with them, that would have been pretty impressive, to be honest with you. So what are the issues with using blockchain for stuff like this? Well, essentially, there are a number of issues because of the way the architecture is deployed. And the first thing to highlight is that it's quite energy efficient, because every node in a blockchain stores and processes the same amount of data that would be in a centralized system. So if we had a master ledger that was centralized and everyone else just connected in order to read that master ledger, you got one copy of the master ledger, which means you've only got one cost in terms of carbon, in terms of electricity used to power that master ledger, in terms of hosting, all the other stuff that you need. With a blockchain, because it's distributed by its very nature in order to assure that it can't be tampered with in the same way and that it can't be changed in the same way, you do have a higher potential cost for running the blockchain in the first place than you would have if you just ran a single dedicated ledger, which is more like a traditional, say, banking system, for example, where it's centralized and everyone just connects in to verify their transactions. The second issue is around reaching consensus, so proof of identity and proof of stake. So if the weight of your vote is directly proportional to the weight of your vote is directly proportional to the stake that you hold in the blockchain. So if you ended up in a situation where you own the majority of assets, you can essentially vote anything through, because you will always reach the consensus because you own over 50% of the nodes in that blockchain itself. So you could basically vote through anything you wanted. It puts the power in the hands of the person who owns that major stake. And that's one of the problems with a first past the post system like that, where you end up with whoever gets to that 51% or over 50%, even if it's sub 1% margins, you're still going to have enough to be able to just vote a change through and force it into the blockchain. So in theory, if you were really unscrupulous, you could take control of a blockchain by doing something like that. Sometimes complete transparency isn't ideal. So within a blockchain, there is transparency around the way that something has been put together. It is a sequence of transactions that lead to an end result. But sometimes there are things like intellectual property, there are things like even state secrets, or things that do necessarily need to be kept confidential. And there are things like strategies and things in the future that a company might be planning to do. And some of the data on that blockchain might be indicative of what that company is planning to do. So you could end up, because you were on a blockchain trying to prove that your products are really awesome, really green, really sustainable, sharing some stuff that you actually didn't want to, but you don't have the power, you don't have the ability to restrict that and say, no, actually, I don't want to share this particular piece of information. The blockchain is the blockchain, everyone gets a copy, right? So people can look at that data. Scaling, so every time your network must have a copy of a transaction made, every device needs to get a copy of that transaction. So it's hundreds of copies of the same data. If you've got big blockchains, you've got hundreds of nodes, that's every one of those nodes has to have a copy of every single one of those transactions. And just to give you a really interesting example that I found, Visa's payment system, so the credit card provider, can process 24,000 transactions a second. Bitcoin can manage 7 transactions a second globally. So big difference, right? There's also silos, so there's a lot of startups popping up which are aiming to create specific blockchain ledgers for specific things. So this goes back to our Hyperledger Fabric versus Ethereum Fabric topic that we were going to talk about from one earlier slide. So if you're constantly popping up creating new blockchains which are isolated from each other, you're starting to get away from what blockchain is kind of for, which is introducing that transparency across things. If you've got 10 blockchains when you could have one, then you're starting to segregate information up into all these different chains. And effectively, you're just creating silos of information. And that's going back to the intellectual property, the secrets, the strategies, all that kind of stuff. So again, there are disadvantages with this. And then finally, in the regulation space and in the compliance side of things. So let's take fintech for an example, and Bitcoin, again, fintech is probably the best example where the blockchain's used. Typically, we stress test financial systems, right? I mean, the 2008 financial crash taught a lot of people across a lot of countries that you really need to be stress testing your financial systems. Well, with systems like blockchain, they're not resilient in the same way, because if you start smashing a blockchain with a huge amount of resilience transactions and stuff like that, it's got to propagate all of those to every single ledger around the network, to every single node. And then you're getting into very quickly the limits of what the blockchain can manage to update in a second, when we go back to the Visa and Bitcoin example. So you have to be very, very careful with how you stress a blockchain. And there are reasons that we haven't seen people like credit card providers and major financial institutions moving over to those. And there's a reason why we don't have the stress testing going on within things like Bitcoin in the way that you would with other systems. So back to my sandwich and to that magical ingredient, calcium propionate. I told you there was a point to talking about the sandwich. Where does it come from, and what has all of this taught me trying to go through all of this exercise what damage was done in making it and getting it into my sandwich, and is it really safe for me to be eating my sandwich, given that it has calcium propionate in it? I still actually have no idea, because there isn't a technical solution that I could find that allowed me to do that in the world as it currently is, working with the suppliers of my sandwich, of my bits of bread and my pickle. I can't tell you what the answer to my question is. And by extrapolating into the blockchain and starting to think about that, I was basically putting my architecture hat on a little bit and trying to think about ways that that could be achieved in the future. Incidentally, by the way, when it comes to calcium propionate, Wikipedia does state that it's banned in certain countries because there was a statistically significant difference in the behavior of children who had consumed it. That's something you'd probably want to know, right? But we don't. We don't think about the things that we're putting into our bodies. We don't think about the things that are in the products that we're consuming necessarily all of the time. But the whole point of this presentation is there isn't really a way to know stuff like that at the moment. I mean, you could Google every ingredient that's in your sandwich, but hey, if we had a blockchain that had these accreditations, that had these safety marks, that had these checks and balances in there, if that kind of data was in the blockchain, you might be able to make a more informed choice about what it is that you're eating. So if I'm honest, that's put me off just a little bit from eating that sandwich again. That's it.
That's great, Julian. I love it. So, wow, I just want to acknowledge that as an amazing presentation. I can tell you, coming from my perspective, thinking about it in a non-technical way many times, this is one of the easiest ways for me to get a handle on blockchain. And there are a few questions that came in that I want to pose, but I just really want to tell you that calcium whatever that is.
Yeah, it took me a while to get that. To be honest, I had to practice that a lot, like in front of a mirror. I couldn't for a long time. I was like, even pronouncing it's hard, right? So why am I putting it in my body without knowing where it comes from? Yeah, it's weird.
Right, I love it. Well, even noticing that, what I think is most interesting about what you share there is food manufacturing is very sensitive, right? There are food recalls that happen every so often, and if it happens because of this particular ingredient, there's a chain of custody that's got to be followed, and that you weren't able to identify it, maybe not the end of the world, because the manufacturers have to be able to. They have to know where they got it. There's got to be somebody there. You as a consultant doing some investigation from the outside, maybe they're not as open with people like that as.
Well, indeed, yeah. Maybe they just didn't want to tell me where it's from. That could be it, right? But the guy that I spoke to said, I'd really love to be able to help you out because it sounds interesting. But yeah, I actually genuinely can't tell you. So I'd have to go and do a whole bunch of digging. And I'm sure, they could dig back through their records and find out where that particular batch came from. They have to be able to, because as you say, if there's a recall, something like that, they've got to be able to deal with it. But it's not easy, not transparent. And I would argue that would be a selling point for their product.
Well, absolutely, right? So a couple of questions came up. And the very first one I want to bring up is, you talked about the performance of blockchain versus internal systems like what Visa has. They're running mainframes and they've got, huge computing power and huge bandwidth and huge everything. So yes, 24,000 transactions a second, and probably can scale from there, is often a really key number. And I've worked with a number of folks that have worked directly with Visa, so I know something about their architecture and what it looks like.
Even better. Hopefully my numbers are right.
Yeah, right. But blockchain being distributed, and blockchain having a limitation of 7 transactions a second, can you talk to us about the practical use of blockchain when you've got a limitation like that?
Yeah, I mean, so the practical applications are limited in some ways, but in other ways they're sort of almost exponential, I guess. So it depends what you're trying to do with it. So Visa and people like that, I mean, they were just a random example I picked. And at the time that I sort of Googled it, those were the rough numbers I found. So apologies to anybody if they know those numbers aren't 100% accurate, but they were a pretty good example of the magnitude of difference that you have there. But what you're trying to do with Visa is very different to what you're trying to do with Bitcoin, right? So that there are different applications it's different strokes for different folks effectively. So there's different things that you're doing with blockchains versus with Visa. So a lot of the thing about blockchain is, as I said, it's in the ownership space, it's in the provenance space. So it's about proving immutably and with absolutely no option for someone to refute it, that you own a particular thing or that you can say where that particular thing came from. Whereas what Visa are trying to do is a different application where they're just processing a bit of transaction information essentially about a purchase, and all they really care about is whether the money moves from A to B in the right way, gets between the two different points, the start and the end point for that transaction. They're just that bit in the middle. So they don't need this this huge ledger and this non-ephemeral, blockchain where they can trace everything back. They need to keep the history of their transactions, sure, but they can do that in one place because they are the ultimate authority for all of their transactions. They're not looking to make everyone's transactions available to everyone in the world so that everybody can be sure who spent what where. Whereas with a blockchain, with something like Bitcoin or with something like the ownership of that tweet that I mentioned, you do want to be able to share that with the world, because otherwise people might doubt whether or not you own that thing. Do you see what I mean? So that you're kind of doing two different things with the technology, and they are very good solutions for the specific types of problem that they are trying to solve, but they're very different in terms of the specific type of problem that they're trying to solve.
And this also kind of leads into the next question, which is about the supply chain traceability. So we all get how important supply chain traceability is. And when you kind of drew it out, right, that really helped. But what is the impact that you can have by using a blockchain inside of a supply chain traceability application?
Well, so I think it would be useful in a lot of ways because, I picked a rather silly and flippant example of a sandwich here, right, to go with something simple. But I mean, equally, it could be a server, or it could be something that we're buying as an architect to deploy somewhere, or it could even be something that we're renting off the cloud, right? And the issue here is that we have the same problem where because there's no kind of centralized authority on where the things came from that are within that supply chain, we can't be sure necessarily that we are being 100% ethical or green, or that we can believe the things that the manufacturers are saying to us about where they get their stuff. If you've got cobalt, anodes in the batteries in your kit, did that come from a mine in a third world country where exploited people are being used to dig it out of the ground? Rare earth metals are a big problem now that electric cars are going bananas. So,
Sure.
You've got this kind of stuff, right? Where how do I know where that came from? And there is no answer to that. I can ask the supplier, but ultimately I can't tell whether what they're telling me is true. Whereas blockchain, if we got that, yeah, you can tell. So if there was more incentivization, as I mentioned in the main presentation, for people to be able to provide that level of transparency, I for one, DDK was founded around ethical goals and honesty and integrity and transparency. So I for one would rather pay more to buy from people who were providing that level of transparency, potentially, as long as it works for my customers. Because I think that's something people would buy into. If you could prove that your technology that you're deploying is green, imagine what that's worth. So I personally think there's a lot of value in that.
Well, listen, let's face it. We all look for certifications. We all look for validation. We all look for, the history, right? And we want to trust our partners.
Indeed,
and we want
we
partners
do. But
that are
blockchain...
aligned also with. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff. No. Sorry, it's a slight delay on the line. What I was just going to say was the difference is with this is that you can see how that certification is arrived at. Whereas basically you are taking it on trust with another product that's got a certification stamp on it that the person who certified it did their job properly. With a blockchain, not necessarily. You can actually see how they did that job and when they did it and where they did it and so on and so forth.
No, that's great. And, I want to just jump to our last question because I think it's the most important question that I saw.
Sure.
So you talked about a sandwich, and then you mentioned there's a city named Sandwich. So the question is, have you been there?
No, Sorry, I've let the side down there. Yeah, I haven't. It's a little ways away from where I live in the UK, probably not by American distance standards, but by mine certainly. So I haven't been to Sandwich, no. I have been to a place called Toaster though. So you can make a sandwich in a toaster. So I'm kind of going to go with that as a bit of a segue between the two. But yeah, not Sandwich, I'm afraid. I should. Apparently it's awesome there. Yeah, it's really pretty. I think it's in Kent somewhere. But yeah, I should get there someday.
Well, I'll put that on my bucket list too. And then, you know, the final question, which is one that I would like everyone to be aware of, is so based on the fact that you're a little bit far away from Sandwich, but you've been to Toaster, how far from those cities will you service clients in?
Well, anywhere basically. I mean, we're happy to work all over the world, to be honest with you. Yeah, so I mean, anywhere you like is the answer to that. Really, it doesn't have to be between Sandwich and Toaster, that's for sure.
No, that's really great. Well, listen, Julian, I want to thank you. This has really been a fun presentation. I know I took a lot away from it, and I've been around the technology a long time, but I will just say that comparing blockchain to a sandwich, and now knowing there's a city named Sandwich and Toaster, like that made my day. So thank you very much.
Place to be, I'm telling you. Yeah, and may I just say thank you very much to everybody for inviting me along, giving me this opportunity to speak. It's been an absolute pleasure. So yeah, thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
Well, that's great. So in closing our session out today, I just want to say to everyone, first off, thank you. You guys have made it possible for these presenters to make the difference that there is to make in environments throughout the world. And over the last 2 days, we saw and learned some very, very important facts about process, about people, about technology that will drive our businesses over the edge. I want to make sure you're all aware that the on-demand recordings are going to be available after the conference. So you'll be getting an email with a private link so you can access the recordings from the virtual conference page. And I also want to invite you to go and look at the BTOES virtual conference series. It's on the insights.btoes.com virtual conference page. And through there, you'll be able to find conferences like the next one, which is coming up on August 16th, AI World Summit Live. And we invite you to check that out, register. I know AI is a huge, huge conversation today as well. Your feedback is what helps us improve. There's a short survey coming up when you log out. Please take a moment and provide us some feedback. Tell us what worked, what didn't work. If you saw any gaps, we'd love to hear that. I know that would make an enormous difference for us as we continue to move forward. And also, to me personally, as this is my first event series with the Proqis group that I'm involved in, and I look forward to doing more. For Proqis, I'm Jeff Cohen, CEO and founder of C-Level Roundtable. I'm the author of Count Onable, which is a leadership guide to lift, shift, and empower you and your team. Please come back and see us again.